Chapter 3. George didn't mean to get into trouble. It's just that he had got these great ideas. Like on their first day at sea, when he had climbed up the huge ladder into the crow's nest. "Aunt Daisy!" he yelled, waving his arms. She had looked up, and she almost fainted. And yesterday, George had explored the entire ship. Aunt Daisy kept warning him that he'd get lost. And she said the ship was like a maze, but George could always find his way, even in the huge forest that stretched out behind their farm. Mama used to say that George had a map of the world behind his eyes. He saw engine rooms and the boiler rooms and wound up on the third-class recreation deck. He was watching some of the boys play marbles when he noticed that he wasn't alone. A little boy was staring up at him with huge eyes the color of amber glass. "See?" the boy said. "See?" And he held out a postcard of the Statue of Liberty. He looked so proud, like he'd carved that big lady himself. George felt like he had to show something in return, so he took out his good luck charm, the brownie knife that Papa had given him for his 9th birthday. He let the little boy run his fingers across the handle, which was carved from an elk's antler. "Enzo," the little boy said, puffing out his chest and pointing to himself. "George," said George. "Giorgio," the little boy cried with a smile. A man sitting near them laughed, and he was reading an Italian-English dictionary and had the same huge eyes as the boy. George guessed that he was Enzo's father. "Marco," he said, shaking George's hand, "you are our first American friend." Marco must have been studying that dictionary pretty hard because George understood everything he said. George learned that Enzo was 4 years old. He'd lost his mama, too. He and Marco came from a little town in Italy, and now they were moving to the New York City. George told Marco about their farm and their trip and explained that any decent person living in New York had to be a Giants fan. For some reason, Marco thought that was funny. When it was time for George to leave, Enzo got upset, very upset. "Giorgio!" he howled loud enough for the entire ship to hear. People stared and put their hands over their ears. Marco promised that they'd see George again, but Enzo wouldn't quit howling. George had never heard anything so loud. By the time Enzo let go of George's leg and George ran back up to the suite, Aunt Daisy was practically howling too. "I thought you fell overboard," she cried. But even then, she wasn't really mad. She didn't get really mad until last night. How that lady screamed when George came sliding down the banister like he really was a giant squid. George didn't mind getting yelled at. He was used to it. Not a day at school went by without Mr. Landers shouting, "George, settle down." And Papa, well, he always seemed to be mad at George. But not Aunt Daisy. And being on this trip was supposed to make her happy for the first time since her husband died last year. It had been Uncle Cliff's dream to be on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. He'd struck it rich selling automobiles and had plenty of money to pay for one of the biggest suites on the ship. And when Uncle Cliff had his accident, George was sure Aunt Daisy would cancel the trip. Instead, she invited George and Phoebe to go with her. And to George's shock, Papa said they could. "Your aunt's going on this trip to find a little peace," he'd said to George. "I expect you to be a perfect gentleman." And if he wasn't, George knew that he'd be shipped off to that army school for sure. Papa had been talking about that place ever since George had brought the 2-foot rat snake into the school to show Mr. Landers because they were studying reptiles. George had been perfect the whole time in England. He let Aunt Daisy drag him to a fancy clothes store for a new pair of boots. He even learned to drink tea without spitting it back into the cup. But, well, the Titanic. The ship gave him so many great ideas, but how he'd really be perfect. No more ideas for the rest of the voyage.